Margaret Hale's children thought they had gotten away with everything. While she lay unconscious in the ICU, they quietly emptied her house, sold her belongings, and even signed papers to sell the home itself. They were sure their 76-year-old mother would never come back to stop them. They told neighbors it was just practical. They said medical bills were expensive, and the house would have to go anyway. But what they didn't know, what no one in the entire town knew, was that Margaret had spent 30 years protecting a secret hidden inside that very house. The secret was tucked behind the kitchen pantry, where an old wooden door waited patiently for the one person who knew how to open it. And the moment Margaret finally woke up, weak but very much alive, that secret would change everything they thought they owned. For more than 4 decades, Margaret Hail had lived in the quiet brick house at the end of Willow Street. It was a modest 2-story home with a narrow front porch and a garden she still insisted on tending herself, even though her hands had begun to tremble with age. The house wasn't impressive by any modern standard. The paint was fading in places. The fence leaned slightly toward the sidewalk, and the roof probably needed replacing within a year or 2. But inside those walls lived the entire story of Margaret's life. The kitchen where she had baked birthday cakes for 3 children who were now middle-aged adults. The living room where Christmas mornings had once been filled with wrapping paper and laughter. And the small back bedroom where she had sat beside her husband, Daniel, during the final weeks before cancer took him away 32 years earlier. After Daniel died, everyone had expected Margaret to sell the house and move somewhere easier to manage, maybe a small apartment or a retirement community close to town. But she refused. She had raised her children there. She had buried her husband from there, and she had made a promise to herself that no matter how quiet the house became, it would remain hers for the rest of her life. 4 years, she kept it going through sheer determination. She worked part-time as a bookkeeper well into her 60s, carefully saving every extra dollar. She planted vegetables in the backyard each spring. She repaired things herself when she could and hired help only when she absolutely had to. To neighbors, she seemed stubborn but capable, the kind of elderly woman who still insisted on walking to the grocery store instead of asking anyone for a ride. What no one noticed, however, was how rarely her children visited anymore. Robert lived 40 minutes away in a larger city and worked long hours managing a real estate firm. Diane had built a comfortable life across town as a marketing executive who traveled constantly. And Mark, the youngest, moved from job to job, always promising he would visit more often once things settled down. Months would pass without any of them stepping inside the house where they had grown up. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Holidays slowly shifted from Margaret hosting everyone at Willow Street to Margaret being invited to other people's homes instead. Still, she never complained. She told herself children had their own lives and responsibilities, and that expecting too much from them would only lead to disappointment. But everything changed on a rainy Thursday evening in early October. Margaret had just finished washing the dishes after dinner when a sudden pressure spread to the right side of her head. Then a dizziness hit her so hard she had to grab the edge of the kitchen counter to keep from falling. She tried to call out for help even though she knew no one was there. The words never formed. The next thing she remembered was the cold tile floor beneath her cheek and the faint sound of water dripping from the sink while the world slowly faded into darkness. It was nearly an hour before a concerned neighbor noticed the kitchen light still on through the window and decided to check on her. By the time the ambulance arrived, Margaret had already been unconscious for some time. At the hospital, doctors moved quickly. They ran scans and tests before finally confirming what they feared, a moderate stroke. She was transferred to the intensive care unit, where machines monitored her breathing and heart while specialists waited to see if swelling in her brain would go down. When her children were called that night, they rushed to the hospital, looking worried and exhausted. At least, that was how it appeared to the nurses who watched them arrive. But after the first long conversation with the doctors, something shifted in the way they spoke to each other in the hallway outside Margaret's room. Robert was the first to say it out loud. "If she doesn't recover fully, we're going to have serious medical bills," he said quietly, glancing toward the closed ICU doors. Diane nodded, folding her arms. "The house is the only real asset she has." Mark hesitated before adding, "We should probably start figuring out what to do with it." The discussion that followed sounded less like worried children talking about their mother and more like business partners planning a complicated transaction. By the end of the night, they had convinced themselves that handling things early would make the situation easier later. Within days, they returned to Willow Street with spare keys and a plan. Moving trucks began appearing in the driveway. Robert arranged estate buyers to examine furniture. Diane listed antique pieces online. Mark boxed up old photographs, dishes, and clothing without looking too closely at any of it. When neighbors asked what was happening, they gave the same simple explanation every time. Mom is very sick, and we're just preparing in case she can't come back home. The explanation sounded reasonable enough, but it didn't stop people from whispering as they watched Margaret's entire life being sorted, priced, and carried away while she remained unconscious in a hospital bed. In less than 10 days, the once warm house on Willow Street felt strangely hollow. Its rooms echoed with emptiness where laughter and family dinners had once lived. The furniture was gone, the closets nearly bare, and even the small desk where Margaret kept her papers had been emptied into cardboard boxes destined for donation centers. By the end of the second week, Robert went a step further. He contacted a realtor and quietly began preparing the house for sale, convinced that by the time Margaret woke up, if she woke up at all, the decision would already be finished. Standing in the silent kitchen one afternoon, he glanced around at the old pantry door. He had no idea that only a few inches behind the shelves was a narrow wooden panel hidden perfectly within the wall. It was a door built decades earlier by a man who believed some things were too important to leave in the open. Robert closed the pantry without a second thought and walked away, never realizing that the one part of the house they had never bothered to inspect was a very place that would soon prove they had sold something that was never truly theirs to begin with. Margaret Hale's children believed the difficult part was already finished. The house on Willow Street was nearly empty. The realtor had scheduled multiple showings, and the paperwork for the sale was moving forward quickly in their minds. It was simply a matter of time before everything was finalized and the money divided between them. What they didn't realize was that 3 miles away in a quiet hospital room, Margaret had just woken up. At first, everything felt distant and blurred. The steady beeping of machines, the low voices of nurses, the heavy feeling in her arms and legs. Slowly, the memories returned. The kitchen floor, the dizziness, the ambulance lights. The doctor later explained she had suffered a stroke, but had been lucky. The swelling in her brain had gone down, and with therapy she had a strong chance of recovery. Margaret listened carefully, nodding when appropriate. But only one question mattered to her. "My house?" she asked quietly, her voice weak but steady. "Is everything all right?" The nurse hesitated for a moment before answering. She had overheard conversation from Margaret's children in the hallway during the past week. Conversations that sounded less like worry and more like planning. "Your family has been taking care of things," the nurse finally said. Later that afternoon, Robert arrived carrying a folder of papers and the calm confidence of someone who believed he had handled a difficult situation responsibly. Margaret looked relieved to see him at first. "Robert," she said softly, "how is the house?" He sat down beside her bed and spoke carefully. "Mom, while you were here, we started organizing things. The house is a lot for you to manage now, especially after this." Margaret watched his face quietly. "Organizing." Robert nodded. "We sold most of the furniture already, and we're putting the house on the market. It'll help pay for your care and make everything easier." She took in what he had just told her. "You sold my home?" she asked finally. "It's the practical thing to do," Robert replied. "You might not be able to live there alone anymore." Margaret's voice became very soft. "Did you check the pantry?" Robert frowned slightly. "The pantry?" "Yes," she said. "The back corner." Robert shook his head. "Mom, it's just shelves. We cleared out the food boxes. Nothing important." Margaret studied his expression, then slowly closed her eyes as if she were too tired to argue. "I see," she whispered. 3 days later, she surprised the doctors by insisting on leaving the hospital earlier than planned. She wasn't fully steady on her feet yet, but her determination was impossible to ignore. "I only need to see my house," she told them. That weekend, Robert drove her back to Willow Street. As the car turned onto the familiar road, Margaret saw the small sign near the front yard. for sale. She said nothing, but her grip tightened slightly on the cane resting in her lap. When they stepped inside, the silence of the house felt strange and hollow. The furniture was gone. The walls were bare. Rooms that had once been full of life now echoed with emptiness. Diane and Mark were already inside, discussing closing dates with the realtor. They stopped when they saw Margaret walking slowly through the doorway. "Mom, you shouldn't be here yet," Diane said quickly. Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she looked around the room one last time before turning toward the kitchen. Her children followed, unsure what she was looking for. The kitchen looked almost the same as before, except emptier. The counters were clear, and the small pantry door stood slightly open. Margaret stepped toward it. "Did you take everything out of here?" she asked. Mark shrugged. "Just some canned food. Nothing else." Margaret nodded gently and opened the pantry door fully. The shelves were mostly empty now, but the wooden panel at the back of the corner remained untouched. She reached inside and pressed her fingers against a small section of wood. There was a quiet, clicking sound. Robert frowned. "Mom, what are you—" Before he could finish the sentence, part of the pantry wall shifted inward. A narrow hidden door slowly swung open. Dust drifted through the air as light from the kitchen spilled into the small space behind it. Inside were metal filing cabinets, several sealed boxes, and a large steel safe built directly into the foundation of the house. For a moment, none of them spoke. They simply stared at the room that had been hidden inside their childhood home for decades. Margaret steadied herself against the door frame and looked back at them. "Your father built this room many years ago," she said quietly, "and it holds everything you thought you already sold." Margaret's children stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the hidden room as if the walls themselves had suddenly betrayed them. The narrow space behind the pantry was small but carefully organized, lined with metal filing cabinets, sealed document boxes, and a heavy steel safe built into the foundation. Dust floated in the air as Margaret slowly stepped inside, her cane tapping softly against the floor. "Your father built this years before he died," she said quietly. "He believed important things shouldn't be left where everyone can see them." Robert finally found his voice. "What is all this?" Margaret opened one of the cabinets and removed a thick folder filled with documents. She carried it back to the kitchen table and placed it down carefully. Inside were property deeds, contracts, and investment papers that dated back decades. When her husband Daniel had started his small construction company in the early 1990s, he quietly began purchasing land on the outskirts of the county whenever he could afford it. Back then, those areas were mostly empty fields that no one else wanted. But over the years, the city had grown, roads were built, businesses moved in, and those forgotten pieces of land had slowly become some of the most valuable properties in the region. Margaret explained calmly that after Daniel died, she had continued managing everything quietly, keeping the records safe in the hidden room. The house itself, along with the land and investments, had all been placed into a legal trust years earlier, one that made Margaret the sole decision-maker for as long as she was alive. Robert flipped through the documents with growing disbelief. "These properties, they're worth millions now," he muttered. Diane stared at the papers in shock. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Margaret looked at them for a long moment before answering. "Because your father and I believed character mattered more than money." A week later, the family gathered in a small office with Margaret's lawyer to finalize what they thought would be the sale of the house. Instead, the lawyer calmly explained that the sale couldn't happen at all. The trust made it legally impossible for anyone to sell the property without Margaret's direct approval, and she had never signed any authorization. The contracts Robert had started were meaningless. Then the lawyer revealed something else. While Margaret had been in the hospital, she had updated the trust. Most of the land and assets would now go to several local charities, a medical foundation that supported stroke recovery patients, and a scholarship fund for single mothers starting small businesses. Her children would still receive something, but only a small portion of what had once been planned for them. The room fell silent as Robert slowly leaned back in his chair. "Mom, we didn't know," he said quietly. Margaret looked at each of them in turn, her expression calm but firm. "You didn't ask," she replied. "You assumed." She stood up slowly, leaning on her cane, and walked toward the door of the office. For the first time since the stroke, she felt completely certain about what she had done. Because sometimes the most important lessons in a family aren't about inheritance or money. Sometimes they are about what people reveal when they believe no one is watching, and about the hidden doors they never thought to look behind until it was far too late. If this story pulled at your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.